Hi everybody. Today I want to talk about an especially serious topic, which is what if you're a perfectly healthy person, you get the coronavirus, and then you don't get better? Is that even possible? Well, I'm here to tell you, yes it is. If you're familiar with my channel, you know most of my videos I'm talking from personal experience and everything is unscripted. In some cases, if I'm quoting specifics, I want to make sure I get the details right, so I will do prior research. For this video, the research I did came from Twitter, but don't discount it because you have to consider who's behind these accounts. In some cases, these are virologists and immunologists who have dedicated their lives to this type of research, or people who are just very knowledgeable about these subjects who are also citing their sources so that you can see that the statistics they're quoting are actually coming from medical journals. Most of this information is coming from Jennifer Brea. If you are already in the ME community, I'm sure you know who she is, but if you're new to all of this, I want to give you guys a quick intro on her. This is from her TED page. Jennifer Brea was a PhD student at Harvard when one night she found she couldn't write her own name. Why you should listen to her TED Talk. Over the following months, while doctors insisted her condition was psychosomatic, Brea became bedridden. She started filming herself and her community that she discovered online, collecting the first footage of what would become a feature documentary about myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME, often referred to as chronic fatigue syndrome. The film Unrest, which premiered at the 2017 Sundance Film Festival, tells Jen's story as well as the stories of 4 other patients living with ME. Brea is also the founder of ME Action, an online organizing platform for ME patients around the world, many of whom cannot leave their homes. So as part of this organization, ME Action, that Jen founded, there is an event called Millions Missing, which is planned every year for the past 5 years. It takes place on the 12th of May. And the point of that is to raise awareness about ME and try to get the medical system to acknowledge that ME exists, try to get doctors educated about ME, try to get laws changed so that people who are bedbound and housebound actually qualify for some kind of assistance, try to get funding for research, just, all of the aspects that go along with trying to stop this illness from being ignored and make some progress. Like I said, in 2017, the documentary Unrest was released, so the following Millions Missing really blew up. They had over 100 cities in so many different countries. I planned a Millions Missing in my city 2 years ago. This is my t-shirt. And I was planning to plan one again this year, but of course because of the coronavirus, it will not be taking place physically. So I'm hoping that this video can be my contribution to that, and hopefully by some miracle I will manage to get it edited and uploaded today. But I can tell you guys, because of my ME, this has been a real struggle for me just to get through all of this information in the first place. So without further ado, March 15th, a tweet from Jennifer Brea. Please stop telling young people they should avoid COVID-19 infection to protect the old. Tell them to protect themselves. Long-term symptoms 6+ months post-infection. EBV 11%. Q fever 11%. Ross fever virus 11%. West Nile virus 31%, SARS 87%, Ebola 90%. COVID-19, we have no idea. In general, the topic of long-term post-infectious sequelae is not well studied, probably for the same reasons ME/CFS has not been well studied. But maybe a few 100 million people being infected by a novel zoonotic virus will unfortunately change things. The quality of data by infectious agent varies a lot. By the time we start worrying about survivors, the pandemic apparatus has usually long moved on, and the money just isn't there to study the people left behind. But there are some studies that should give us all pause to think, and to start including morbidity, disability, as well as mortality in all of our COVID-19 public health messages. Many of those who are long-term ill from these infections experience symptoms very similar to chronic fatigue syndrome, ME/CFS. If that doesn't strike fear into the heart of all the 20-somethings living it up this weekend in New York, Chicago, etc., it damn well should. And then she goes on to quote several studies. West Nile virus. Among a cohort of participants with a history of West Nile virus, 31% reported experiencing fatigue post-infection that inhibited their daily activities. The average length of fatigue duration was 5 years with a range of 6 months to 10 years. Of those with fatigue post-infection, 28 or 64% met the CDC's case definition of chronic fatigue syndrome. West Nile virus RNA was demonstrated in 5 of 25 or 25% urine samples collected from convalescent patients 573 to 2,452 days or 1.6 to 6.7 years after West Nile virus infection. Females, those younger than 50 years of age, and those with symptomatic clinical West Nile virus disease were significantly more likely to report fatigue. SARS. Multiple studies show that at 6 months post-SARS, patients have lower SF-36 scores. Lower means 6-minute walk distance and muscle involvement, or myalgia, in 50.8%. Epstein-Barr virus, Q fever, Ross fever, 3 completely unrelated infectious agents. 11% meet criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome 6 months later. Only risk factor, severity of the initial infection. Ebola. Prevalence of post-Ebola syndrome was estimated to be 90%. Symptoms included neurological system, eye problems, headache, sleep disorder, and unusual tiredness, and musculoskeletal system, abdominal pain, chest pain, and joint pain. A lot of people have responded to this thread by saying, but we have to protect the old too. Yes, of course. And millions of chronically ill, disabled children, teens, and adults too. And we have to protect the young and healthy who either haven't heard or don't give a shit about the people they might infect because we've failed long before this moment to warn them of what can happen when they get sick. And even if that were not true, we know that developing ME/CFS symptoms is a risk of many, many different kinds of infections. The difference here is that we have never in memory had a novel infection that was poised to infect such a significant proportion of the world population. It's important that we track cases long term. I think if we took ME/CFS seriously, that would be a normal part of infectious disease surveillance. I hope it can be this time around. March 28th, Dr. Mark Guthridge tweets, coronavirus and an ME/CFS outbreak? Impaired immune responses to viral infection are one proposed ME/CFS trigger. Some SARS-CoV-2 patients are relapsing, suggesting that a virus-eliminating immune response may be impaired in some patients. Ominous. April 13th, Dr. Turnbull tweets a quote from an article in the New York Times called "We Need to Talk About What Coronavirus Recoveries Look Like." The quote says, employers will need to reconsider expectations of COVID-19 survivors, and we can expect disability law to be tested. A wave of chronically ill and slow-healing survivors is an inevitability we can and must prepare ourselves for. April 13th, Dr. Phil Hammond tweets, now would be an excellent time to plan some research into new treatments for post-viral fatigue and ME/CFS, and for rehabilitation post-ventilation. All these could have a huge health impact. Tanya Marlowe replies, researchers Julia Newton, Mark Van Ness, Leonard Jason, Ron Davis, and virus hunter Ian Lipkin are at the forefront of this research already, with ME Research UK and the ME Biobank doing great work too. If you can highlight and promote their work, that would be great. And Jen replies, agree. The time to support, fund, and highlight these researchers' work is now. Carolyn Day tweets, I got ill during the last pandemic, swine flu, H1N1, and I never recovered. I have now had myalgic encephalomyelitis for 10 years. If you're suffering viral or post-viral fatigue as a result of SARS-CoV-2, please listen to your body and rest as much as possible. March 14th, Jen tweets, as the US and many other countries brace for an uptick in new infections, hospitalizations, and death due to COVID-19, here is one other problem almost no one is talking about: long-term chronic illness. Gay Leon replies, a similar number of people who had SARS were left with symptoms like ME. It's called post-SARS syndrome. I think it's almost certain that people with this coronavirus will too. They'll probably call it post-COVID-19 syndrome, but it's still ME. Jen continues, it can often be triggered by a severe viral infection, could be a far more common outcome than death, and yes, afflicts the young. This study found that of people infected by Ross River virus, Epstein-Barr virus, or Q fever, 3 completely unrelated infectious agents, 11 met ME/CFS criteria 6 months later. The only predictor of developing long-term symptoms was the severity of the initial infection. We, in the ME/CFS community, have watched over the years the post-Ebola syndromes, the enteroviral outbreaks, and see all the people who survive but are left dealing with long-term sequelae. It could happen with COVID-19. It must be tracked and counted too. So, if you're in your 20s or 30s, not disabled or chronically ill, and think you're bulletproof, like I did, remember that infections can do so many more things to your body than kill. And for the sake of all the people out there who are disabled or chronically ill of any age, for the love of God, do your part to keep us safe. Dr. Mark Guthridge tweets, the key risk factor for post-infective ME/CFS is the severity of the initial acute illness and not age, sex, or psychological factors. Something to keep in mind when examining patients for the possibility that SARS-CoV-2 has triggered ME/CFS. Jen tweets, sorry to be a broken record on this, but infection is a major trigger of many chronic lifelong illnesses in people who are young. So it's not just that the young may be a vector, they may get sick and never truly get better. And she links a tweet from Dr. Mark Guthridge that says, coronavirus and ME/CFS. We know that ME/CFS can be triggered by a range of viral pathogens. So it's likely that coronavirus could trigger a worldwide spike in ME/CFS in the next 6 to 18 months. On that thread, he goes on to say, for those unlucky enough to develop post-coronavirus ME/CFS, their lives will change forever. People with ME are 25% housebound, less than 7% recover, quality of life is worse than cancer, 80% undiagnosed after 2 years, no treatments or cures. We are past the point of COVID-19 containment, so the young and healthy, 1, could be victims of post-coronavirus ME/CFS, 2, should not consider that the coronavirus only affects the old and sick. 3, have the most to lose from years or decades of post-coronavirus ME/CFS. Back to Jen's thread. 11% of those infected having some kind of long-term symptoms 6 months later is not an unreasonable estimate. As to how many remain sick in the years or decades to come, we just don't know. No one has ever studied the question. But there are post-Lyme, post-Epstein-Barr virus, post-Q fever, post-Ross fever, post-Ebola, and post-SARS syndromes. They are distinct, but have a lot in common. I would be shocked if we aren't talking, but barely, because by then our collective conversation will have moved on about post-COVID syndrome. I would not be surprised if the young, because of their stronger immune systems, are more at risk. I hope in the next week the conversation can move past protect your parents and grandparents to protect yourselves too. Arlette Poulin says, I've been thinking about this as well. I've heard predictions that half the population will get COVID, most of them without major symptoms. If 11% meet ME criteria 6 months later, we're screwed. That's a lot of people. Konya Anist replies, is it bad that I hope that maybe then with this sudden increase of numbers they might realize that this is serious and start funding more research on this? Or in Germany, start with doctors actually acknowledging what ME is? Rakesh says, I have long-term ME CFS after DUNG. I've been thinking about this too. Thanks for giving voice to a concern that we literally know nothing about yet. Whitney Fox says, I think mine started after H1N1 in 2009. If only we had more research about those viruses and their impact on our chronic illnesses. I also have reactivated EBV and had mold exposure in 2015, which both worsened my ME. The "it's just a flu" line makes me so angry. Kay Liaden says COVID-19 will no doubt create more long-term illness just like SARS did, only on a much bigger scale. Jen replies, we should know a lot more about this. In fact, it should be an integral part of pandemic preparedness and data gathering. We should be thinking not just about this year, but the 5, 10, 20-year consequences. MDs, researchers, take note. New thread from Jen. As it stands now, a certain percentage of people will have long-term symptoms after getting sick from a wide range of infections. These people are generally discarded by the medical system and their communities. They are also people who are now high-risk COVID-19, even as people continue to pack bars and restaurants as though nothing is about to happen. It's important to understand that the range of possible symptoms and possible risk factors for severe complications is broader than what is currently being reported. Trust me, anxiety sucks much less than central apnea. A case series of 3 hospitals in Wuhan found that 36.4% of COVID-19 patients had central and/or peripheral neurological symptoms. These symptoms included headache, dizziness, impaired consciousness, ataxia, and epilepsy. Some of the respiratory symptoms may be attributable to central apnea, that is, a dysfunction in the brainstem's ability to tell your lungs to breathe. According to the complaints of a survivor, the medical graduate student, 24 years old, from Wuhan University, she must stay awake and breathe consciously and actively during the intensive care. She said that if she fell asleep, she might die because she had lost her natural breath. It is possible that the respiratory aspect of COVID-19 is so overwhelming in patients who end up dying that they don't live long enough for the virus to cause damage to the brain, said Dr. Nath, who is director of the section of infections of the nervous system at NINS. He added that deaths attributed to respiratory failure may in fact include brainstem involvement that is not apparent. I'm interested in this because there's another illness that used to occur in epidemics that also began as an upper respiratory infection and could cause profound, long-run central nervous system and peripheral muscular symptoms, myalgic encephalomyelitis. Whether post-enterovirus, post-Epstein-Barr virus, post-SARS, post-COVID-19, we need to put much more effort into studying post-infectious neurosyndromes, not only as isolated phenomena of distinct outbreaks, but also as a whole. Todd Davenport tweets, any discussion of post-acute COVID-19 rehab is incomplete without talking about ME/CFS. That's it. That's the tweet. Another thread from Jen. This is pretty unconscionable. Oxford Health is recommending yoga, dancing, and cognitive behavioral therapy for post-COVID-19 patients who continue to have symptoms when we don't even understand COVID-19, let alone the sequelae it causes. It conflates what happens to most of us after a flu with the complete unknown of what happens after a novel virus. It assumes these sequelae may be due to mental health problems instead of, say, brain or organ damage. It recommends graded exercise to a population who may have lung damage, a population in which it has never been trialed. And based on its recommendations of the, frankly, historically abominable abuse of patients with ME/CFS, and evidence from that patient population which has been thoroughly debunked, if passed as prologue, a subset of patients with COVID-19 will experience lingering and in some cases lifelong symptoms. We know this from past outbreaks of coronavirus and a wide range of completely unrelated infections. patients. It is really important that we both treat these patients as a unique population with its own challenges and understand how they relate to all the other populations who have also experienced post-infectious sequelae after a range of infections. We should both lump and split. What we absolutely must not do is psychologize post-COVID-19 patients, treat them with a confused mishmash of pseudoscience, fall back on age-old tropes where we laud the strong who won the COVID-19 war through sheer force of will and blame those who did not fully recover. Illness is still not a metaphor. Ableism is not a public health policy. Victim blaming is not medicine. Wishful thinking is not science. Incuriosity is a choice. While human nature has not changed and neither have our symptoms, we have all the lessons, wisdom, language, and community organizing to do better this time. For these patients, we must. April 18th, David Lilienfeld tweets, as an epidemiologist, I'm amazed that the only thing that's discussed about COVID-19 and the lockdown is mortality. It's not just mortality though. A 25% pulmonary function deficit that takes 15 to 20 years to heal, some sort of coagulopathy present in a third of patients, long-term implications still not clear, neurological deficits, do you really think that only smell and taste are affected? Joint inflammations now being investigated and liver damage, all of these aren't exactly appealing. Everyone talks about death. I think we physicians blew that one. We all know that kids are infected. It seems relatively benign. Do they have any alterations in their neurobehavioral development, growth? The comparison is often made to the flu. The flu is not neurotoxic, and it isn't hepatotoxic either. And while there are some pulmonary consequences, they're pretty rare. April 19th, Jen tweets, as a culture, we fear death, but we don't fear illness from which you never recover, that which may have protracted recovery. I'm trying to wrap my head around the reasons why more MDs aren't raising this problem early and often. I think a part of the problem is that we haven't invested a lot in researching these post-viral patients. Historically, once the outbreak is over, people's attention moves on, those who survive but are disabled left out of research in medicine. April 22nd, Phoebe tweets, I wonder if those who develop ME symptoms after COVID-19 will be diagnosed with something brand new. They'll have ME, but under a different name, and it or they will be respected, supported, and generally treated well by society. Plus, the government will pour money into research. Jamie replies, it will be called post-COVID syndrome and be met with great sympathy at first. Then the sympathy will turn to hypotheses about medical PTSD. Then it will be called kind of hysteria in an op-ed by a PhD with arms crossed in his bio who considers himself a straight talker. May 3rd, Brian Vashtek tweets, UK people who say they have ongoing COVID-19 symptoms, neurological issues, bad fatigue, etc. are being shunted to anti-anxiety treatments and talk therapy, which is how the UK deals with this debilitating post-viral neuro-immune illness. May 4th, Jen replies, what the hell? The pandemic is 2 minutes old. My husband and I got sick March 22nd, and me a few days later. We're both still sick. We understand almost nothing about this virus. Psychiatry, back the fuck off. May 4th, ME/CFS News tweets, I'm so sorry for the COVID-19 survivors who will develop ME/CFS and then discover that medicine doesn't know how to help because they never took ME/CFS seriously. Can this pandemic be a turning point where neglect ends and earnest search for understanding and solutions begin? UK psychiatrists have a lot of responsibility for this situation, having promoted the false scientific theory that ME/CFS is a combination of lack of fitness and anxiety. May 6th, the Jen tweets, when I have posted on social media about this, I too have found a lot of people sharing that it took 6 weeks or more to recover. I also believe this is the disease itself and not post-viral fatigue syndrome. I know this because I had ME, and I know that what I'm experiencing now is nothing like it. ME is qualitatively different and also much, 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 much worse. Because of the stigma and lack of medical interest in ME, they will find there are no effective treatments waiting for them. Fingers crossed that you and me and all of us recover completely and soon. May 11th, Brian Vashtek tweets, "Good background for reporters on COVID-19. Researchers expect a surge of chronic illnesses, including myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, which can be lifelong and disabling. Why?" And he goes on to quote this article, "A large body of research shows that long-term illnesses and disability can be triggered by viral infections. Up to 80% of cases of ME/CFS are initiated by infection, but may also arise in the wake of a surgery or traumatic injury, similar to Guillain-Barré. The ME/CFS community, researchers, clinicians, advocates, and patients are deeply concerned about the potential for COVID-19 to develop into ME/CFS and other post-infectious diseases and disorders. The NIH is currently studying post-infectious ME/CFS at their clinical center in Maryland. There's a lot of evidence that when a severe infection sweeps through the population, ME/CFS will often follow. SARS-CoV-2 would not be the first coronavirus to result in documented ME/CFS. Studies have shown that long-lasting disabling symptoms commonly occur in people who contracted two other coronaviruses, SARS and MERS." So that is a lot of information, and I don't want to spend too much time just reiterating exactly what they said, but to recap really briefly, you can get ME from something as small as a normal flu or mold exposure. Pandemics like this are so much worse than the normal flu, and all of them have been shown to have a significant number of people continuing to have symptoms who did not fully recover a long time after they were infected. And we can already see in the past few months that there are people who had this current COVID who have not recovered. So even though it's still too soon to say if they have ME or not, they clearly have something, and there's really no doubt about it. There will be an unfathomable number of people who have some sort of post-COVID syndrome, whether it's ME or not. What Jen and these other people are doing is trying to encourage the people who are tracking the number of people infected and mortality rates to track this too, so that we actually have better statistics and longitudinal studies. We can be better prepared and handle this better and use this information for future pandemics. Because right now, we're still in the midst of it, but if we wait, then it's going to be too late. We can't go back and do this after the fact because, like they said, people will have lost interest, the funding will be gone. Chances are, first of all, that a lot of these people will have something identical to ME, but it will be called by another name, which means that they will get the attention and support, and all of the people who've been previously dealing with ME will continue to be ignored by the medical system. The good thing is, if these people can get the support they need, then whatever treatment helps them will probably help the rest of us too. Unfortunately, because we've already been through so much trauma with our own experience with medical systems in whatever country we happen to live in, a lot of us already have this uncomfortable feeling that the people who end up with this post-COVID syndrome will eventually be treated the same way that we have been. The other point of saying this now, while it's still so early, is to encourage people to take better care of themselves. You can be a lot more careful now to protect yourself and others and avoid this ever happening. Even though I'm putting this out there now and we are still in the midst of all of this, this video is going to be online in the future. So once this is over, if you find yourself in this position, you might come across this video and be wondering, what do you do now? You might feel lost and alone. Well, first of all, I have done a series of videos on my story with each of my diagnoses where I explain what the diagnosis is and my personal history. separately. You can watch that and see what we're alluding to when we talk about the sort of medical trauma that we've been through, the recommendations for treatment that is actually very harmful and has been debunked. When I was doing my research for this video, I looked at a lot of different organizations because there are multiple IME organizations in most countries. I've got to say, the one where I found the best information was IME Action's website. They had certain research and statistics where it was very specific. They quoted the studies. It wasn't just something very vague, and mentioned a lot of things, a lot of information that I couldn't find on other websites. So I would say that is the best place to go. You've seen from this video that the founder of IME Action is already on top of this, so just imagine how much more they're gonna know further down the line. So I would highly recommend, if you do find yourself in this position, turn to them, and that will be the place to go for information and support. The reality is, a lot of people are going to be dealing with this, just because even if it's a fairly low percentage, so many people are going to be infected. So the percentage of people who don't get better is going to translate into a large portion of the world. Hopefully this will be a turning point where research gets done and a cure is found and things get better for all of us. Anyways, I have been pushing myself for days to find all of this information and compile it, and now I have a very long video to go and edit, so I'm gonna leave you guys there. Hopefully I managed to get this online today. So yeah, that's a pretty bleak note to leave things on, but that's where we're at.